This video lecture for Philosophy 2310, Theory of Ethics at Marquette University, is focused on the third section of Kant's Grounding of the Metaphysics of Morals. You'll recall that I spoke about the image of an onion, and that is we peel back layers and layers of Kant's moral philosophy until we see what is at the very center, and from that very center it all grows outward, just like an onion does. I want to use that imagery again here. Now, I also mentioned to you that it's a good idea to keep close attention to exactly how he titles each of these sections. This third section is called Transition from a Metaphysics of Morals to a Critique of Pure Practical Reason. So Metaphysics of Morals is the structure of moral theory according to Kant. And we're going to transition from that understanding of the moral theory according to Kant and the foundations for the moral theory to a critique of pure practical reason. That is, a critique of this, and to see what really lies at the very foundations, because it can't stand alone. It needs foundations, and here we're going to explore those foundations. Kant says at 446, in a discussion about the nature of the will, something we haven't pursued enough yet so far, he says the will is a kind of causality belonging to living beings insofar as they are rational. That means that only human beings will have will. And the causality, we're able to do things with our will. Freedom, he goes on, would be the property of this causality that makes it effective independent of any determination, I'll correct that, any determination by alien causes. So freedom means we're not determined by something outside of us. If we have true freedom, we are not determined by something outside of us, some alien cause. Similarly, he goes on, natural necessity is the property of the causality of all non-rational beings by which they are determined to activity through the influence of alien causes. A non-rational being, it could be this bottle of eye drops, and it's determined by causes outside of itself. That is, it's determined by gravity. So it's not a rational entity. Further, other animals don't have rationality, so they're determined by their environment. Human beings, however, are quite different. Human beings are not controlled by natural necessity because they have freedom of will. And they are rational beings. The rationality makes it possible for us then to think about the options and make our choices. So rationality makes us free in a very real sense, so that we can be responsible for our actions. So again, the will is a kind of causality belonging to living beings insofar as they are rational. All right, so again, only rational beings have will. And freedom is the property of this causality that makes it effective independent of any determination by alien causes. Nothing outside of me makes me do what I do if I have freedom. And for Kant, human beings have freedom. So free will. What exactly is free will when we combine these two terms together? Is it, pardon me, I'll correct that. Is it complete liberty to do whatever we want? Not for Kant. Not for Kant, because remember, we are controlled by our need to show respect. That is, we are morally controlled. We can always refuse to be moral, but in fact we are not free to be immoral for Kant. That is contrary to our fulfillment as rational beings, contrary to what we are. So Kant writes this about freedom of the will. Pardon me. Then he writes, what else then can freedom of the will be but autonomy? And we saw what autonomy was in the previous section, on section 2. And here he defines autonomy for you. That is, the property that the will has of being a law unto itself. So according to Kant, that's what it is. Freedom of will is autonomy. That is the property of the will has of being a law unto itself. That is, the moral law comes right out of our own selves. That's what we had with regard to autonomy, which means self-law. So the moral law comes right out of the very nature of ourselves as rational beings. And the will This is the property that the will has of being a law unto itself. Nothing outside us determines our autonomy, and our will is in accord with our autonomy. So in that sense, we are free. We are free to will as we wish, and we manifest ourselves most fully as the rational beings we are when we act in accordance with autonomy, that is, act in accordance with the moral law that is inside of us. Kant goes on here now further. The proposition that the will is in every action a law to itself expresses, however, nothing but the principle of acting according to no other maxim than that which can be at the same time have itself as a universal law for its object. That phrasing is the phrasing of the categorical imperative. So, the will in every action that it expresses is nothing but acting in accordance with the categorical imperative. And so we are free to act in accordance with the categorical imperative. We are not morally obliged we're morally obliged not to act otherwise, but to act in accordance with the categorical imperative, insofar as that directs our will toward the right thing we should do as rational beings. That is, to act with respect. He goes on to say, now this is precisely the formula of the categorical imperative, and is the principle of morality. So that's the principle of morality. The free proposition of acting as a law unto ourselves as autonomous, and to be able to act with respect for ourselves and others, which the categorical imperative demands. And this is the principle of morality according to Kant. He then says, a free will and a will subject to moral laws are one and the same. And what he means by that is a free will is one that's not controlled by things outside of it. Like the notion of having the good will, whereby we can only do things that are good if we fully have the good will, we will not be tempted to do things that are less than good or things that are bad. So too here, a free will and a will subject to moral laws are one and the same. That is, a free will, as properly expressed, is the will of a person who wills to act in accordance with the categorical imperative, that is, to act in accordance with respect. Those who don't act in accordance with respect are pulled away from their real nature. They're heteronymous. They're pulled away by other things and not expressing their true self, their true moral law that is already inside of them. That is autonomy. Now, according to Kant, morality follows from freedom. Because if we're not free, then how can we be moral if we're controlled by things outside of ourselves? So we must be free in order to have morality. So morality is a consequence of freedom. But in the case of the good will, even more is required of us. Morality, then, for Kant, follows from the analysis of freedom, but what we seek is a synthetic connection between the good will and our freedom. That is, we want to put these two together. Our good will and our freedom are integrally connected. But what we seek is a synthetic connection between the good will and our freedom, such that we are morally required to seek the good will and to act on its maxims. So that's what he's looking into. He's pulling away the layers of the onion here, and he wants to see the synthetic connection that bonds together the good will and freedom, such that the expression of our freedom will be the good will. Now, what about the nature of this freedom? Can we prove the existence of freedom? According to Kant, we can't, because all of our actions can be explained in virtue of pre-existing causes. I am the way I am because of my genetics, because of my upbringing, because of the way I reacted to growing up and the way I reacted over the years to my environment, and it seems that everything I've done is caused. I bring a causal analysis to it, and it seems that everything is caused by pre-existing causes, and if everything is caused by pre-existing causes, it seems that I have no freedom. That's the difficulty with regard to the notion of absolute freedom. So Kant says we can't prove the existence of freedom. He says freedom must be presupposed for there to be morality, so it's a presupposition. We have to assume freedom exists, and that we are that. Otherwise, the word moral doesn't mean anything for us. So freedom must be presupposed for there to be morality. And so we attribute to every rational being both autonomy and freedom, which makes morality possible. So we have to be autonomous and free in order to choose our intentions, make our intentions with regard to any action we do, and to fulfill ourselves by guiding our choices and our willing in accordance with the good will. And the guide in that, the real practical guide, is the categorical imperative, which I said to you earlier should be something like putting on a piece of paper the rule that tests everything to see whether it fits the categorical imperative. If it fits the categorical imperative, then it's permissible to do. So he really wants you to take that notion of the categorical imperative and use it as a tool to keep yourselves or ourselves in line with what is morally right. So he says, when we start with the idea of morality, we necessarily assert the existence of freedom. We have to do so. Because if we say that someone is morally responsible for an action, it means that the person could have done otherwise. But the person chose to do X instead of doing Y. And the person was free to do that, not controlled by things outside. So our job is to keep ourselves autonomous and not allow our goodness and our will to be pulled away by power, money, pleasure, other things that pull us away from being the respectful persons that we should be. And respectful, again, I'll repeat it, respectful in the sense of the first person you must show respect to is yourself. Secondly, it's another rational being. But first, so when you lie, steal, cheat, etc., the first person to whom you show disrespect is yourself, and the second is the person to whom you show that disrespect by lying, cheating, stealing, etc. So in this context, for Kant, reason must regard itself as free insofar as it is practical reason and the will of a rational being. So our reasoning regards itself as not controlled by things outside of it, because we use it as a tool to see what we should do right in action, namely practical reason. So it is practical reason and the will of a rational being that makes us free. So we assume in our reasoning that we are free to act in accordance with our reasoning and not controlled by something outside of us. He then writes the following. This is to say that the will of a rational being can be a will of its own only under the idea of freedom. Only if so the idea is that only if I have the idea of freedom can I explain how my will is really mine and not controlled by other things, controlled by the environment, controlled by genetics and other things. So this is to say that the will of a rational being can be a will of its own only under the idea of freedom. If you don't presuppose the existence of freedom, then you can't have free will. If you can't have free will, you can't have morality. He goes on, and that such a will must therefore, from a practical point of view, be attributed to all rational beings. And that's what we do. We attribute that freedom of will to all rational beings because we hold them morally responsible for their actions. So a presupposition is this freedom. Just as we had with Aristotle, we looked at the presuppositions of virtue, the preconditions of virtue. The precondition here then is that we have the idea of freedom. If we presuppose the idea of freedom, then we can understand that we will in a free way, and we will in a free way because we are rational beings, and that means that when we think about things and weigh the possibilities, we're able to exercise our own will. So this is key. But he says you can't prove the existence of it. So I've had classes where I've tried to show that you can't prove the existence of free will, and I've just walked out of class. And I come back and say, does a spontaneous action like that indicate that my action was not caused? Well, no, the action was caused by the choices I made in my mind and what I had planned out for the class. So the problem is that you can't demonstrate free will, because it seems that every action has a prior cause, and it's controlled in virtue of that. So what we're going to need to do is realize that there's another reality. for human beings. So Kant's philosophy is very strange in the sense that there is another world and another reality for us. What we see around us is not the totality of our reality. In the world, we don't see freedom. We talk about it a lot, but we don't see absolute freedom. And yet we must have the notion of freedom in order to account for morality. So take note, however, that freedom is only an idea, and it can never be proven to exist in our ordinary world of experience, as I just said. And so Kant holds that there is no possible experience which could prove the existence of freedom, because everything that we do can be explained in terms of pre-existing causes. So, why should we be moral? Or to put it another way, why do we in fact accept submission to the moral law? Why do we be moral in these cases? And I have to pause here for a moment. So let me resume here. Why should we be moral? Or to put it another way, why do we in fact accept submission to the moral law? According to Kant, there can't be self-interest in it, or something for me to gain, because then it would not be a categorical imperative, but rather it would be heteronomy. That is, it wouldn't be coming from myself, but from something outside. Am I moral because God's going to give me eternal life if I'm good? Is that the right sort of way to be? Or should I be autonomous? And I do what's morally right because it's morally right, and because I've determined myself to be a person who does his duty. That is his moral duty, and does what's right because it's right. If it's for the sake of some kind of reward, even heaven and everything else, or anything else, then it's heteronomy. I'm not acting in accordance with my true self, my autonomous self, but I'm being, as it were, bribed by something. And we're not doing what's right because it's right, we're doing what's right because it'll give us a prize of some kind. So that's why Kant rejects this sort of thing. So the question is, why do we, given this, why do we in fact want to submit to the moral law? Why must we give so much credence to the categorical imperative? To put it another way, why do we accept that? So he's criticizing himself here. He's raising issues about the approach that he's taken so far. He says, quote, "We do not see how this is possible, and hence how the moral law can obligate us, that is, obligate us to do what we ought as moral persons. Where is the obligation? Why do we do this?" And Kant says, quote, "One must frankly admit that there is a sort of circle from which it seems there is no escape." Close quote. So why do we do it? He says, first of all, we hold for both freedom and causality. We think that there's a causal determinism in things, and yet at the same time we think that we are free of that causal determinism because we have free will. We say that we are free of determinate causality so that we can assert ourselves to be moral beings subject to moral laws. And that's through our autonomy. I mean, if everything has a cause, then it would seem even freedom has a cause, which doesn't seem to make much sense. And yet, we say we are causes of our own actions, such that we assert the soundness of the idea of determinate causality. Now, what he means there is, well, look, if we're the causes of our own actions, then the idea of causality does make sense. So what we have is an idea of freedom that can't be explained in the world and has to be assumed, and yet at the same time we accept in the world the notion of causality, that everything is caused by pre-existing causes. And that notion that everything caused by pre-existing causes seems to undermine the idea that we're free. So Kant is facing right up to this difficulty. That we seem, on the one hand, that we analyze the actions of others in terms of causality, but on the other hand, we think ourselves to be free. How can we deal with this sort of assertion of contradictory claims? Or simply put, can we be both free and at the same time determined? So Kant writes this, "However, one recourse still remains open to us, namely to inquire whether we do not take one point of view when by means of freedom we think of ourselves as a priori efficient causes, that is, we think of ourselves as free and able to act, And another point of view when we represent ourselves with reference to our actions as effects which we see before our eyes. So the two standpoints are these. First of all, I think of myself as free when I do an action. But secondly, when I look at actions, I always trace them to pre-existing causes. So there's a contradiction here. How do we handle this? And he says that we have to inquire into this. Now, this is phenomenology. Phenomenology is when you deal with appearances. Phenomena are appearances, and logos is study of. So phenomenology is a study of the appearances. According to Kant, with our senses and our minds, we can only grasp appearances, or phenomena. Try as we might, we can't grasp directly things in themselves. We see them only from our perspective, only through the structures of our own minds. I used to have glasses that had a pinkish tinge to them, and I would look at the world through rose-colored glasses. Well, also, I look at the world through the structures of the mind. I mentioned this earlier in one of the earlier lectures. And the light that comes into these glasses is distorted to make it possible for me to have 20/20 vision. So do I see things directly in themselves, according to Kant? No. I see things through the structures of the mind and the experience that takes place in me. That is, it's as if I'm curled up in a ball, and I don't see things outside of me. I only see things as they come to me, as they appear to me, and I don't know whether they are real in themselves. So he takes this phenomenological approach. We cannot grasp things in themselves. He says then, hence, we can attain to a mere knowledge of appearances, but never to knowledge of things in themselves. If that's the case, that we really can't know things in themselves, then we need to study the structures of the mind through which we apprehend things, because those are the conditions of the things we apprehend. So this leads Kant to assert a distinction between two worlds, a world of sense and a world of understanding. Because this is incompatible. In the world of sense, we seem to be caused in everything we do. And yet we do individually hold that we are free in our own decisions and actions. And that's the world of understanding. So for Kant, we have one foot in each world, so to speak. We live down here in the world of sense and causality and causal determination. And yet at the same time, we assert that we are free. And we are not causally determined by things outside of us. We are truly autonomous. And that's of another world, according to Kant. So there are two perspectives on the universe, so to speak. We have a world of sense and a world of understanding. The world of understanding is where we are free, where we know ourselves to be free, or at least we assert ourselves to be free. But we live in this sensible world where every time we try to analyze things, we analyze it through the structures of causality. And those structures say that everything is causally determined. So Kant is an otherworldly philosopher in the sense that he asserts that we are members of another world. We are not solely animals of this world. With our rationality, then we are of another world. The world of sense is where we learn about ourselves from the empirical realm of sensation. But what we learn cannot be true reality of what we are, because what we learn is that everything is causally determined, according to Kant. And yet we assert ourselves to be free, so we are not members of this causally determined world alone. Rather, we are also members of the world of understanding. We assert the existence of this realm because we hold the view that we are free, and we are self-directing entities, members of an intellectual world of rational being. And there we are free. So we have these two realities, according to Kant. The reason, and in this context, then, reason is the key to grasping our true natures. As Kant says, then, quote, a rational being must regard himself as intelligence as belonging not to the world of sense, but to the world of understanding. Now let me go back. Remember, I talked to you about Kant's notion of morality, and that there's what morally ought to be the case. Metaphysics of Morals concerns that. And then there's practical anthropology, what people in fact do. And with our morality, we bring these absolute moral values. The most absolute of all is respect for rational beings. We bring these, as it were, from the other world and insist that they must come to exist in this world, a world where we in fact know that they don't always exist. So morality is something we bring to this physical world in which we live. And we insist upon it. We impose that on our reality, and we say this is the true reality. Human beings truly are free in their actions. They're not determined, as it would seem, as we analyze the various actions that people do. They're not determined, but these people are part of a world of understanding. So this is the way he divides the worlds, and this is how he accounts for freedom, even though you can't prove it in any physical experience of the present world that we live in here as physical beings. Rather, it's another part of the mind, the world of understanding, where we are truly free. So as a consequence, we have to regard ourselves from two different standpoints. We are members of the world of sense subject to laws of nature, heteronomy, laws outside of ourselves. We are members of that world. But we are also members of the intelligible world, subject to laws which are not empirical, not in the world, but are founded on reason alone. And those things founded on reason alone are freedom, morality, rationality. And I think that I will take a pause here and make this a two-part video then, because I've gone long enough on this. So we'll have another part that'll complete the rest of Kant's Grounding the Metaphysics of Morals, Section 3. For now, I'll just pause here. I'll stop here, and this will be then the video for Section 3, Version A.